Okay everyone, welcome to another exciting episode of the CEAP Avian Training video series. This is DJ McNeil, one of the CEAP crew leaders for the Golden Wing Warbler research field season. Remember to only use the CEAP Avian Training video series as a supplement to your avian training regime and not the sole method of learning your birds for the field season. It's best to think of this more as a refresher rather than a primary learning tool. For those who have any questions about anything in here, be sure to send me an email. If you have access to this video or found it, you probably have my email. Yeah, so let's get right into it. The Woodpeckers and the Wrens. The first woodpecker in our group here is the Red-bellied Woodpecker. I figured I'd start us off with a pretty easy one. And honestly, most of this group is pretty straightforward. The red-bellied woodpecker, like a lot of the woodpeckers, is a sexually dichromatic species. We have our male here on the left, displaying this red cap, which goes from the tip of the bill over the crest and down to the back of the nape here. The female, in contrast, has essentially this bare patch or an uncolored patch of head here at the front. The forecrown might have a little bit of blush, but the top of the head is so the same base buffy color as the bird itself, and the red is limited only to the nape area. Otherwise, the male and the female are pretty darn similar. Both sexes have this kind of barred, checkering looking wings and mantle, as well as a white rump, which is much more evident when the bird flies, and a dark colored tail. You can also see on at least this one and somewhat on this one the reddish kind of hue to the belly where the bird gets its name. This is a medium-sized woodpecker with a pretty large bill here. The drumming is really indistinct. I'm happy to play it for you guys here, but it's not one of the essential ones for sure. In my opinion, the drumming is fairly nondescript, so don't worry about knowing the drumming of the red-bellied woodpecker, but here it is. It's pretty fast, it's not terribly loud, but what I do want you guys to know are the primary song, or at least the territorial call of the red-bellied woodpecker, and some variations of the call. So the call, or excuse me, the territorial call song is a rich quirr, quirr. It's a pretty distinctive call, and once you kind of get it in your head, it's pretty easy to remember. Now the call, there are several different calls, and they're all kind of variations on the same theme. They do this kind of chug, chug, chug call, or sometimes a single chug, and they can either do it as a single chug, a repeated kind of chug, 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 or a trill set of chugs. So I'll play some of that for you. So here are some of the singular chug notes. Or I guess those are repeated ones. But also note that when the birds get excited, they can produce sort of a chattery trill of those chugs. And we won't worry about this, but just tuck this in the back of your mind that all woodpeckers can do a sort of a wacka wacka type call when two woodpeckers meet on a tree and begin interacting. But for the red-bellied woodpecker, focus mostly on the quirr song and the chug calls. The next woodpecker is the Yellow-bellied Sapsucker. These are a pretty cool one. There's several different things I'd like you guys to know about Yellow-bellied Sapsuckers, but they're all pretty easy. So again, just like the red belly, we've got a sexually dichromatic bird here. Males and females look essentially the same, with the marked exception of the throat color being brilliant scarlet on the male and plain white on the female. The amount of yellow on the belly, breast, and flanks can vary from white to a lot of yellow in this bird, but it's not really a field mark that I tend to hone in. Again, it's a medium-sized woodpecker, and another distinctive trait about this bird, in addition to having a red throat, which is pretty much on no other woodpecker, at least a distinctive red throat in contrast with the rest of the head. Both sexes have this white shoulder here, so that's a really distinctive thing that no other woodpecker really shows prominently like that. As for vocals, the yellow-bellied sapsucker produces a really annoying screaming call as kind of its territorial song, which I'll play for you. It's kind of a series of squealing screams, which tend to be kind of slurred. In addition to that, they produce a kind of a mew call, which is just a soft like mew, mew. And in addition to that, the drumming is very distinctive for the yellow-bellied sapsucker. It tends to be kind of a staccato, a random burst of pecks against the tree, which kind of gets slower at the end, but it doesn't really seem to have a rhythm to it, which is unusual for woodpeckers. So here are some drums from yellow-bellied sapsuckers. It's really interesting to watch them do this because it's literally the bird's just hammering its head really hard against the tree. So here's some mews and drumming. And just like a lot of the woodpeckers, they do produce a kind of a wacka-wacka interaction call. But again, don't worry too much about that. Focus on the sort of mew scream call, the mews, and the drumming. The next in our group is the red-headed woodpecker. We won't spend much time on this for a couple of reasons. First of all, they're pretty rare. And second of all, they're pretty distinctive. We do want you guys to know this bird because it's so rare, and it's a bird of conservation concern in many regards, but pretty simple to ID. It's got a clean white belly, dark wings and dark tail, with secondary flight feathers which are white, and that's true of both the adult and the juvenile, and both sexes. The juvenile will have black tips on these, but still this white patch on the wings is evident both when the bird is perched and when the bird is flying. Also, the entirely plain red head with no distinct markings is pretty much found only on the red-headed woodpecker. The calls are also quite distinctive on the red-headed woodpecker. They're a really kind of horrific scream or series of screams. They're pretty flat in quality in contrast to the sapsucker, which has that kind of squealing, down-slurred scream. So here are some screams from a red-headed woodpecker. Also notice that the drumming is pretty flat, kind of nondescript drumming. Really not like the sapsucker or anything else. They do kind of produce a rattling call as well. I don't expect you to know it, but it's worth noting that they do that. Okay, the next bird in our woodpecker group is the Pileated Woodpecker. These guys are really easy to identify. For one, they're humongous. This bird is about the size of a crow, and they're loud. They make a lot of noise. A couple of things to note: it's really the only woodpecker in our area which bears a really obvious crest. Again, it's humongous, and it's got this like distinctive kind of long neck with the black and white markings on the face. It's sexually dichromatic, but it's somewhat subtle. The male has a complete red crest that goes down to the base of the bill. The female has a black forehead. And the male also has this red mustache, whereas the female's mustache is just kind of plain black like the other stripes. Like I said, they're huge. They have these white patches on the wings, which are really evident when the bird flies. And the calls are pretty straightforward too. It produces a loud series of kecks, and it can either kind of do them in a short series or a longer, like drawn out series. We're going to talk about the northern flicker next, but note that those two can sound somewhat similar, but we're going to pay careful attention to the pileated woodpecker's like kind of powerful quality to each of the notes, as well as how each note sounds more like a keck, whereas the flicker, each note's going to sound like a wick or a flick. So here's a short call of a pileated woodpecker. And here's the longer, drawn-out call. And again, note how powerful it sounds and how each note sounds kind of like a keck, keck, keck. The drumming of the pileated woodpecker is also distinctive enough that I ask you guys to know this species. It's a very powerful drumming that trails off at the end. Okay, the next woodpecker that we're going to talk about, as promised, is the northern flicker. Visually speaking, it's a very distinctive bird. It's medium-sized, more like the red-bellied, although a bit bigger. It's got this barred back and a spotted belly. The spotted belly is pretty distinct for a woodpecker. It's also got this little check mark on the breast, which is distinctive for a woodpecker. But the fact that it's brown overall on the back anyway is also very distinctive. All the other woodpeckers tend to be kind of black and white in colors like that. It's got a buffy face with a gray nape. Both sexes have this little red spot on the nape here. But the male wears a black mustache and the female wears no mustache. This race, I'm not sure what it's called, group of flickers that we have in the eastern U.S., they're kind of known as the yellow-shafted flickers. You can see that the shafts on the tail feathers and the primary flight feathers are yellow, in contrast to the western birds, which are the red-shafted group. They have red tail feather and flight feather shafts. And the male red-shafted flicker has a red malar stripe. But I believe everything that we're going to have, even as far west as Minnesota, should be pretty much yellow-shafted flickers. We're just going to call it the northern flicker for the purposes of this study. The vocals are pretty straightforward. The song is a loud, clear skew or pio. And the call, which is the one that can sound somewhat similar to the pileated woodpecker, is a repeated series of wick notes or flick notes. And notice that this is it's kind of a weaker sound, maybe tends to go on a little bit longer than the more powerful like keck notes of the pileated. Here's the pileated woodpecker. So again, here are those flick notes of the northern flicker. Okay, I believe we have two more woodpeckers in our group, the next of which is the downy woodpecker. This is the smallest woodpecker that we see in our study area. Pretty easy to identify. We've got kind of a checkered wing, dark mantle with a white stripe going down the back, black and white face, pretty small little guys, bigger than most songbirds, but still not nearly as large as most woodpeckers. Males have this little red spot on the back of the head. The female is just black and white with no red. And notice that the beak on the downy woodpecker is a nubby little beak, just very tiny. Like all woodpeckers, they sit against the tree with their tail propping them as almost like a third leg. And the vocals are pretty easy for this guy as well. So their primary sort of territorial call is a descending whinny. And I should also mention that with most birds, you can identify male and female. You can sort of sex them based on this presence of a song. With most woodpeckers, both sexes produce the song, and therefore I don't recommend that we identify or sex woodpeckers based on the song. So for example, if you hear a singing downy woodpecker, it could be a male or a female. So without further ado, the descending whinny of the downy woodpecker. And again, the descending piece is key. We're going to talk about the hairy woodpecker next, which does not descend. So notice that this song is kind of a descending whinny. And again, notice it starts off kind of level and descends more towards the end. The single call of the downy woodpecker that I'm asking you guys to know is just kind of a pick call or a tweak call, and it's just a soft, kind of a cute sounding pick. It's often just given as a single note. Now let's compare this with the hairy woodpecker. The hairy woodpecker is a little tricky because in many ways it looks just like the downy woodpecker. The key difference between the hairy and the downy, and we're going to talk about this again, is the size. It's a pretty good sized woodpecker, similar to the others we've talked about, the red-bellied and the hairy, the flicker. But the beak is proportionally much larger. Those are going to be the characteristics I want you to focus in on. Again, we've still got a bird that's got a checkered wing, a dark kind of mantle with a white stripe going through it, striped head. Males have a red spot, females do not, but this large beak coupled with the large size. The calls are also really easy to identify. At first they sound a little similar, but if you kind of get a trained ear for it, they're pretty easy to tell apart. The hairy woodpecker produces a trilling kind of whinny, if you will, just like the downy, but instead of being kind of descending at the end, it's level throughout. So it doesn't descend at the end. It's also much harsher and ends up sounding more like a sputter. So it's a very harsh sounding, kind of sputtering, territorial song. And even the peak call, which is very much like the downy woodpecker, it just sounds much more harsh and much more aggressive, almost like the call is being forced out of the bird. Let's compare that with the downy woodpecker's pick call. Much harsher on our hairy woodpecker. Here's the hairy again. And physically speaking, again, our hairy woodpecker is much larger than our downy woodpecker. I tried to kind of scale them to about what I would guess the average sizes compared to each other, and then the proportion of the bill. So our hairy woodpecker has a really long bill with respect to the size of the head. Almost really the same length as the head, not quite, but in this individual it's pretty darn close. In the downy woodpecker, you wouldn't even start to think that. It's just got this nubby little bill, and these kind of bristles near the nares can often almost completely even cover up the bill because the bill's so small and the brushy feathers by the face are pretty long. So that does it for our woodpeckers. We have I think 5 wrens that we're going to talk about, and that'll be the conclusion of this video. So let's jump on into them. So before we get too carried away with the wrens, let's just talk about what sort of a wren is. Wren is a small songbird, and they tend to be brown. They kind of stick close to the ground for the most part, hanging out in the low-growing vegetation. And the thing that's tough is there's another group of birds in another one of the CEAP videos that looks pretty similar, and that's the sparrows. Or at least they look similar to beginners. A trained eye will teach you that these birds are really not similar in many ways. They're both passerines, and that's kind of about it. So 2 main features between wrens and sparrows. They're both kind of what you might call a LBJ, a little brown job. But the wren has this kind of long, slightly decurved bill. It's an insectivore. It kind of snatches small insects out of vegetation. Whereas a sparrow has this kind of fat, short little bill, which is better adapted for eating seeds. Sparrows do eat insects as well, but they kind of specialize more on seeds. Wrens don't really eat seeds at all, maybe occasionally berries and things, but these are primarily insectivores. Another thing to note between sparrows and wrens have a lot of this kind of barring on the wings and the tail. It's kind of subtle on this marsh wren, but we don't have anything like that on sparrows typically. And also notice that the tail is typically cocked. Not always, but they often hold their tail up like this. And I cannot think of a single species of sparrow that holds its tail up in any way. It's pretty much just out, occasionally down, but the wrens will hold that tail sticking up like that. So let's get into the wrens. Okay, awesome. So let's start with the house wren. The house wren is honestly one of my favorite birds. It's the bird that I first learned how to do any kind of avian research with, working at the Kellogg Biological Station. Really learned a lot in that setting. So the house wren's kind of near and dear to my heart. Pretty cool little bird, but very plain overall. So we do have this barring in the wings and in the tail, like I mentioned, that you see on most wrens. This individual even has a fair bit of barring in the flanks and up into the breast a little bit. But overall, it's pretty plain. Kind of the main feature you see is sort of these warm, potentially rufous tones in the wings and tail, kind of a cool brown head that kind of fades into a lighter belly. So kind of the quick glance look we see is darker colored bird above, lighter below, some brownish coloration overall with sort of red kind of concentrated towards the back of the bird. Otherwise, it's pretty plain. The supercilium, which is this eyebrow area, which we're going to refer to a lot in the wrens, really doesn't stick out much. We don't see much going on. There's no really a lot of markings in the face, maybe a vague mask of sorts, but really just kind of a brown bird overall. Not a lot going on there. The song is a complex, sort of rich series of warbles. It tends to start with a series of chattering notes. You often hear this in movies and things like this, and you hear it around yards. It's a very beautiful sounding bird, complex song, but notice how rich and warbling the notes are. This is going to contrast with our next bird, the winter wren. Let's listen to that again and notice that it starts with a series of chattering notes. All of the wrens are going to have pretty complex songs, but by and large they're distinctive from one another. Okay, our next little wren is the winter wren. So a couple things to note about the winter wren. First of all, just kind of taking a quick look at it, we've got a chocolatey sort of brown overall, a cocked tail, like a really cocked tail, like almost vertical, and it's pretty short. Look how it's got this nubby little tail on it. Pretty long legs, but it's a fat little bird with a nubby little tail. And remember, our house wren was kind of a darker brown above with a lighter brown below. This bird is mostly dark brown on both sides. It's kind of the same color no matter what angle you're viewing it from. It's got this barring on the wings and tail, just like our house wren did. But this chocolatey coloration overall is distinctive for the winter wren. a bit of a colored, a lighter supercilium, not super distinct, but a sort of lighter supercilium here. And this bird is tiny; it's literally like mouse-sized. The song for such a tiny, kind of drab little bird is remarkable. It's a complex, beautiful series of clear whistles and trills all strung together, and they can just sing and sing and sing. You'll find them in very mature forest, often in kind of wet areas, kind of boggy habitats with very mature trees. So here's the winter wren's very beautiful song. Notice the clear whistles here. Notice how flute-like a lot of those notes can sound. And let's compare that with our house wren. Remember, this winter wren we just heard has these very clear flute-like whistles. The house wren has the rich warbling notes. So our winter wren is comprised mostly of clear whistles. Okay, our third wren in this group is the Carolina wren. Physically speaking, it's a very distinctive one. On the vast majority of individuals, we have this very bright, kind of rufusy red above with this really nice, like almost peachish buffy below. A lot of the wrens have pink feet. This one tends to have very nice pink feet, long decurved bill like many of the wrens, and also this very bold, bright supercilium here, just the stark white supercilium. The throat is also contrastingly white, contrasting with this buffy flank and breast and belly. So pretty distinctive in that sense. It's also a pretty good sized wren, a bit bigger than the house wren and the winter wren we've talked about here. The song is also pretty distinctive. It's kind of a rolling, rich tea kettle, tea kettle, tea kettle, tea kettle, tea kettle, or cherry, 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 cherry. And it tends to have kind of a bit of a snappy component to it, kind of an angular component to each of the tea kettles. But there is a lot of variation. Most of the time they do a song that sounds something like tea kettle, tea kettle, tea kettle, like so. Okay, so remember how I just pointed out that it has kind of that angular quality to it? The reason I say that is because the Kentucky warbler can be kind of tricky and sound somewhat similar. So the Kentucky warbler, remember, has a rolling cherry, 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 cherry song. So here's the Kentucky warbler's less angular, less powerful cherry, 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 cherry. And one more time, here's our Carolina wren. Kentucky warbler. And Carolina wren again. The other thing that's probably worth noting is, it's not critical, but I'd tuck it away in the back of your memory banks, is the cheer call of the Carolina wren. They seem to do this often, so it's a down-slurred cheer, cheer. Okay, we have two more wrens to cover here, and that'll be the end of this this presentation. The Sedge Wren is a pretty straightforward bird, not too bad. Again, we have this kind of cocked tail most of the time. barred wings and tail area, brown overall color, but there's a few things that make it distinctive. For one, the wings are very heavily barred. We also tend to have kind of this buffy tan clay color overall, a light colored throat, breast, and belly, sort of vague supercilium, and a speckled cap here. So those mix of characteristics are pretty distinct from everything else we've talked about. The only thing that can be potentially confusing, in my opinion, is between the Sedge Wren and the last bird we're going to talk about, the Carolina Wren. Or, excuse me, the Marsh Wren. So Sedge Wren and Marsh Wren can be a little tricky to tell apart. We're not going to worry about a call for the Sedge Wren, but the song is good to know and pretty distinctive. It tends to be kind of this sort of dry, buzzy sort of chew, chup, chip, zizzy, zizzy, zizzy. And it doesn't tend to deviate from that pattern too terribly much. It's pretty flat, pretty boring, kind of a buzzy machine gun type final series of notes there. So again, before we move on to our Marsh Wren, notice that we kind of got buffy tan color even in the wings. If you could see the rump, it would be the same buffy color. Not a very distinct supercilium, just kind of a muddy one. Yeah, so let's compare that with the Marsh Wren. So the Marsh Wren has a variety of features that make it different from the Sedge Wren. For one, we've got a brown cap, distinctly brown cap, and a very bright supercilium. We didn't see that in our Sedge Wren, which has kind of a vague supercilium and a very, very speckly cap. Also note the dark color of the mantle here, which we have some color in the mantle of our Sedge Wren, but it's not nearly as distinct. Also the wings. We've got some barring in the wings, like with all wrens, but it's way more extensive in our Sedge Wren. In addition, we've got this very reddish coloration into the back of the rump and the wings, which we never really see in the Sedge Wren. Now, the song for the Marsh Wren is also pretty distinct from the Sedge Wren. The Marsh Wren has this kind of whiny, mechanical, rattling notes, often starting with some squeaky introductory notes and incorporating rattly trills throughout. It's pretty distinctive, so just kind of listen to it and take it in. Okay, so let's recap our wrens really quickly. So here are the 5 wrens we just talked about. So the house wren is plain overall, somewhat lighter below. We might have some reddish tones to the back, but really not any kind of distinctive markings other than that it's darker above and lighter below. The winter wren is kind of plain overall, somewhat of a vague supercilium. It's got kind of a chocolatey look to it, and it's really always got that cocked tail, or that tail cocked. And note how short the tail is. Carolina Wren is another distinctive bird, buffy below, white throat, kind of a reddish, chocolatey brown above. Not chocolatey. It's really reddish. This is one of the coolest brown Carolina Wrens you really find. They're often very reddish above, and this white supercilium. For the Sedge Wren, we've got barred wings, like heavily barred wings, unlike our Marsh Wren. We also have kind of this buffy rump area and wings. Everything's kind of got a buffy hue to it, and the mantle is very lightly marked. The Marsh Wren, in contrast, has very lightly barred wings, if at all. Well, it pretty much always does, but they're very lightly barred. This reddish, this one is pretty much the plainest Marsh Wren I could find to kind of really put things to extremes, but it's got this brownish color to the front of the wing and the rump. Unlike our Sedge Wren, which tends to have kind of this really like tannish color, these tend to have a very reddish coloration to them. The chocolatey brown cap and the very white supercilium. Oh, and the dark mantle, so this darkish area back here tends to be much less dark on the sedge wren. So I think that does it for now for our woodpeckers and wrens. Be sure to let me know if you have any questions about anything in this video. And good luck with your studying, and get out there. No substitute for time in the field.